Okay, cool. So maybe a bit about me, but thank you, Bruno, for organizing and inviting me to speak. Um, yeah, so I actually don't work as a Clojure dev in my day job. I'm actually the head of a design team at a bank in South Africa. With about like 100 designers, more or less. So that's what I actually do by day. But when the full moon is out and night comes, I write Clojure code. So yeah, so it's actually been very interesting because Clojure has changed my thinking, and some of that actually shows in the design work I do and how I think about systems. So it's like a nice synergy. But it's also helped, and I think I appreciate the most is that I can work on code that I care about because it doesn't pay my bills. If something is boring, I just don't have to do it. So that's basically what I did in terms of Clojure. I gave a talk at Clojure Conj and Clojure D and Clojure South. And then I was hoping to give a talk in Finland last year, but Corona. But yeah, so I'm actually quite obsessed with Clojure. So, and today we're speaking about PHP, PCP, and the GraalVM. So hopefully you'll enjoy. I'll be speaking about my journey and how I learned how to use all of these things and in the end build something I think is really cool. But I think like many of you, my journey started with WordPress. Making sites, tinkering, editing some CSS, and so forth. And when I first started web programming, I was still a student, and I mean, I didn't really have a job. I did some part-time work as a developer, so I had a small salary, and so I think a lot of my frame of reference in terms of technology is still based to that view. So when I look at something that's software as a service, I think about how much does it cost? Is it worth it? And I agonize over the details, but it's a habit from back then. So I think the first time I put a site live, I used no support Linux hosting. And I did that because, I mean, I had a small salary and I didn't think it would make sense for me to use something more expensive because if I had to make 5 sites for friends and family and I was spending my salary on that, that's not ideal. So a mate told me about no support Linux and, it was about 1% of my salary for each site. So cool, that's feasible. I can run 10 sites there, not too bad. Then I found about HostGator, and then there you could have like the hatchling plan and you had unlimited sites and they're all running PHP. And that was amazing. And then during that time, that's when I actually learned to code a bit more sophisticatedly, and I moved to PHP. And so, HostGator was great because WordPress runs in PHP, and I kept doing that. I actually ran the first startup I was involved in on HostGator and PHP. And then I heard about Node, and it's like event-driven, and it's dynamic, and it's super cool. So I gave that a try for about 3 or 4 months. Ported my stuff to Node, and it wasn't ideal, but it was really interesting. But the problem was that Node couldn't run on my HostGator server, so I had to get a VPS, and DigitalOcean had some really good tutorials at the time. So they tell you how to configure your box and install like your firewall and block use fail to ban to block like malicious IP addresses and stuff. So it was really cool, and they also came up with this like very simple pricing plan. Because I looked at Amazon because I'd heard about AWS, but to find out how much you'll pay on AWS, you need like a PhD. So at least DigitalOcean's like $5 a month was like very clear. It's like, okay, I get that. And I could run, multiple Node instances or services on there. And so that wasn't too bad. But Node is Node and it keep falling over and just like spaghetti code and spaghetti code. So I was like, no, I'm over this. And then I realized I could just use PHP on my VPS, and basically for small sites, you can just run unlimited amounts, right? Just different directories, and you configure your Nginx, and then it's Christmas. So that's really where I spend most of my time, and it seemed like a very good bargain to me. And then I encountered Clojure, and that's where my problems began in earnest. So the problem with Clojure is that deploying Clojure is, for some reason, very complicated. And when the VPS it would start, but it would randomly shut down, and I didn't know how to get it up and running when I wasn't SSH'd in. And I mean, Heroku's pricing is heck, it's like $7 for the instance, and that's just one. So if you want to run 4 Clojure sites, it becomes a bit more expensive. So I was like, no, this is untenable. So that's where the inklings of PCP started coming from, because like PHP had found a way to run on a VPS at minimum cost, and Clojure is just amazing to write. How can we get the best of both worlds? So I was in a desert for years trying to see how to marry the two. And then when I was at Clojure D, I went to Bork Dude's talk, and it was like mind-blowing. He had made a thing that could interpret Clojure code, worked on the JVM, and it sandboxed stuff. So I was like, okay, that sounds like what I need, because then I can store different bits of code and use these things called Psi, and use Psi to interpret it, and there we go. And so that's like the journey kind of began. I must admit, I've had some questionable ideas, in my Clojure time. Before that, I built like a Kafka clone on Firebase. I'm working on Datomic on Firebase with the guys at DataHike, and but I knew that you can't just execute arbitrary code. That's, everybody knows that's super dangerous. So when Psi came along, I was like, okay, there's finally a relatively safe way to execute this arbitrary code. And so that's where my thinking started. So I'm not sure how familiar you all are with GraalVM and the native image element, but basically the idea is it takes your jar and does things that are above my pay grade and comes out with an executable based on what the code actually does. So you lose out on things like reflection and some of the Java class capabilities, but you now actually have an executable that boots really quickly. And that's something that that Babashka has basically exploited. Yeah, so I mean, this was my thinking, right? So, you have your client, you hit Nginx, and it goes to a node application or a PHP application. And my thinking was, well, why can't you just go to Babashka? There you go, right? Problem solved. And Babashka is super fast, so you don't have to worry. And there you have all your problems solved, and you have replaced PHP. Yeah, the journey was a bit longer than that. But, it was 20 days after, around 20 days after I saw Bork-Dude's talk, I had the first cut of PCP, and it's on GitHub. If it'd be cool if you have a look and let me know what you think. And I guess in a way, like, the lockdown was amazing because I could just spend hours every day writing code because I had nowhere else to go. So you'll see in my GitHub, like, that period is very green. And in our old place, we didn't have a garden in our apartment. So, I mean, it was literally work, code, bed kind of vibe, maybe a movie here and there. But basically, how PCP works internally, it sits it basically works in similar way to PHP-FPM. So it sits between Nginx and your file. The request comes through. It uses a simple CGI interface and loads your file, and then that goes to Psi. So basically, this is what Nginx sends. It sends something like this. This is the SCGI basically communication protocol. It's very straightforward. I didn't land on this because of some great thought. I tried to inspect what Nginx sends and use fast CGI, and it was just, I didn't understand it. So SCGI, you can actually inspect it with a hex editor and understand and read the strings. So I went with that. And one of the reasons, using this was important for me is because it's a default option in Nginx's config, right? Because I didn't want to build something that required, Emacs level of configuration. So I wanted something very simple that could be used very much with the default. So the simple CGI server was a way to basically do that. So once Nginx sends, the request parameters to PCP, PCP then breaks that apart and finds the source file specified, reads that in, and then runs it through Sci, and then responds. So a similar approach to PHP. So I got all that running, and it was pretty neat. And then I started doing the more complicated things like submitting a form, and chaos ensued. But basically, a quick structure of PCP, it has these 5 files. So the core namespace is basically where the majority of the processing happens. So that's where the file is read, it runs through sites, it's executed. That's where like form handling happens, like the form multipart handling happens. And then the includes namespace is basically where we include utility, like common utilities. Like if you want to access your database, if you want to, what else is there? Oh, like encryption and emailers and stuff like that, so that you have some of these common Clojure libraries to use. The response namespace is just a helper to easily map your responses. And then probably the parts where I spent the most work was on the SCGI and the utility. So the SCGI, that took a lot of time because basically you have to build an TCP server internally and then communicate with Nginx. And then the last thing that I put together was this utility, because one of the things that frustrates me very much is when you start a new language and you need a whole other tool chain to get up and running. So I figured let's just have all of the things together. So if you want to get up and running, it's just install this one thing and off you go. So the command line utility has a few nifty functions, but I guess the question is, where's GraalVM in all this? Well, at the point, it was all in GraalVM, right? So the includes were all things compatible with GraalVM, and the utility, the SCGI, the TCP server, everything was in GraalVM. It was great. It just took super long to load. And that's where I learned many things the hard way. It's not ideal to wait 30, 80 minutes to know if your code works. So so on this journey of trying to build everything in as a native image, as a binary using Graal's native image, I found out like I never understood the problem of reflection, just in general. In Clojure it's about the performance hit and such like. But in Graal the problem is because Java in essence is gone, reflection doesn't work. And in some cases it's very deep. So the native image, it keeps trying to compile and running the parts, and then like after 38 minutes, it's like, oh, oops, can't run this, and then the process ends. And so, I mean, and that's why even now, when I'm not working on something to do with Graal, I just have this like, I eliminate reflection with extreme prejudice. I'm like, okay, why is this here? Remove, remove, remove. Because of this experience, I think that evening was super frustrating. Waiting 40 minutes between builds is just not a way to live. So at least the nice thing with reflections, you get the warning in your command line or Emacs if you use Emacs. So there's always a warning. But then this is where it actually really changed, right? So I was like, okay, I want to have an email, because the nice thing you can do with PHP is you can just connect to an SMT server and send your emails. And I was like, PCP would not be complete if you can't just easily send emails. If you have a form and you sign up, you want to be able to send the email. So I was like, okay, let's get Postal as an included library in PCP. And that's where the chaos kind of began, because there's a whole host of errors. And turns out one of the, I think it's there is reflection deep in Java mail. So I went to Java mail and tried to see if I could edit the code to remove the reflection. As you can guess, that didn't end well. And I pinged Vogue dude on Slack. I was like, dude, I'm stuck. Can you help me? And then he said something that really struck me. He was like, why? Just use the JVM. And I guess for me, that was really the third lesson. Most of the time, you don't need a native image, right? I mean, what I was doing didn't necessarily require really a native image. And so I actually went back and started taking apart well, I thought about what he said for a long time, actually, and then I started taking about the code and saying what part should be native image and what part should be in Java. And when I looked at it, it actually made sense, right? If you're going to spend, your whole life trying to make everything compatible GraalVM, you won't get much else done. So I figured let's use the JVM, and I think that's where one could actually benefit off the power of the JVM, because if your JVM is hot, it's really fast. So basically, let's need to have the JVM running all the time, right? So now PCP actually works in that way, that you actually have a core thing running in the background, similar to if you have PHP's FPM, it also just runs in the background. And so it actually becomes a nice like for like. The one part that is still in Graal is the utility, because for the end user, while you're developing, you don't want to, every time you make a change, wait for Clojure to eventually boot up. So that part is still in, still uses GraalVM to build a native image. So basically there's those two parts. You have the native image and the SCGI server, and when you install it, the SCGI runs as a service in the background, and you can use the command line utility for your day-to-day. Right, so what I'm quickly going to do is do a quick demo, and knowing demos, I hope and pray this works. Okay, so I actually have everything here. So if we do here, let's just kill that. That's dead. So basically, this is the utility. Hold on, let me just. I don't know how to make the font bigger. Okay, well, I hope you can all see. So basically, that's the utility, and you can. So if you want to run it, you can do this, and you can run a server. So I modeled this very much after, live server, which is a node utility, which is really amazing, and I hope someday PCP can be that cool. Very simple to run. You run it in the directory, make that directory a server, and you're aces. So here we go. Here it is. And basically what happens, what you're seeing now is this web service has in it, it's got a similar interface to Nginx. And when you navigate to a URL, it takes the request, sends it as Nginx would do to PCP, the PCP service, and it passes it and returns a response. Right, and so the idea is here that you can also get that the same environment as you would when you have Nginx without all the drama. Because one of the things that really frustrated me with PHP was that you had to always put your code in the Nginx folder, or you'd have to have your repo in one place and symlink it to the Nginx folder. And so that was always, for me, like admin, why do I have to change my directory structure when I install Nginx? So with PCP, you can actually just do this from anywhere. And when you eventually deploy it, it's running on the server, and Nginx actually sends the data to PCP. So it creates a very nice developer experience. So here's a super simple site. Oh no, that takes you to GitHub. So let's go back. There's a login button that takes you to another page. It's still very, very bare bones. But the cool thing actually now is if you look at the code, you can see there's actually basically a one-for-one relationship between these pages and the code. So if you go, for example, to the index page, you see that it requires PCP, and it basically runs like the REPL. Right? It just executes line by line, And so here we go. This use bit it's a bit of a hack, because when I first started, I didn't know how to include namespaces in Sci, and I don't know if it's actually there. So use is actually a dummy function that actually just goes and loads the contents of that file into this file. That should hopefully change soon. So it loads components, the CLJ, and this is just basically, like here's a button, there's, the helper. So you actually have to write the hiccup code yourself each time. There's another button with a different class. There's your header, your footer, and then a page template. All the things that you need to have a decent page. There we load your font, the CSS files, and so forth. So in index, all of those things load, and then when you call page, it actually renders the page using this as the main body. So there's a div and class and so forth. And so it becomes actually very straightforward to render different pages, right? So, and then the one difference between this and I guess PHP is that PHP, at any point in your code, you could just return. It creates disasters, because if you return at the top to the client and you try and process later, you get that PHP error saying response already sent. So basically with PCP, you actually want to send it last. And so that's basically how it works. It's response code, what you want to respond, and the MIME type. And here's the same here's the form for the that login page. So that's in essence how PCP side works. And it's very straightforward in that sense. And that's kind of the idea, right? So it lets people use Clojure for simple tasks at low cost, and make deployment easy. And what I'm hoping is that as people adopt, or if they adopt, you can use PCP when you're doing small projects that don't require very serious processing, but then you become comfortable with Clojure, and then you can pay for your Heroku dynamos when you have some really serious work to do. Okay, and then I just wanted to quickly show you what the actual library PCP itself looks like. Okay, so just as you may have guessed by now, I don't use Emacs. I never jumped on that bandwagon. Basically, this is the core namespace. So it's also not very long. Most of it is me trying to process a multi-part request, but the rest of it you can see is really straightforward. So a lot of the work is done by Sci, and Sci has made it very possible to make something so simple, right? And then this is the SCGI server. Again, it's very simple because the SCGI protocol is simple, and just uses a normal TCP server. Okay, so that's basically what the code would be like. Quickly show you. Here's two sites I've built. So that's my Brothers and I's company site. Built it with PCP, very straightforward, nothing hectic. And I'm currently working on the one on the right for client. Again, very simple sites, but the nice thing is you get to write in Clojure whether the problem is easy or hard, which is, I think, the world we all want to live in. But then, yeah, after a while, I felt like I needed to take a break because I had really got deep in the weeds. So I took a break from PCP because I also started to feel that for the next level, I needed to learn more. The first push was based so much on my enthusiasm after Clojure D, and that ran out once I, going all the way in Java Mail really took my energy out. So that's actually how I came across Bruno. When I went and found that Java Mail couldn't be fixed, I figured surely someone on the internet has thought of having a place that tells you all the things that work with GraalVM. And that's where I met Bruno, and I saw his repository. And so as you can see, I just and this was before I gave up on Java Mail. I just went, okay, this would be useful to use in PCP. Okay, it works. Okay, cool. Push it to the repo. Okay, hiccup works. Push it to the repo. Next, JDCC and HoneySQL, those work. Push it. Data script. And so I just went all the things that would be useful. push them there. And so if you're keen, it would be really cool for you to contribute to this initiative, because it basically is a place where everybody will know which libraries work with Graal. Maybe I can actually quickly show you what the thing looks like. It's a really cool project. And so there's this nice little table. When I started, the table wasn't this nice, but now it's really cool. So it shows you the library and whether it works on Graal. So you can also decide, if you actually need to use Graal, which libraries work, and you can decide, do you want to go and find that yourself, or do you want to use one of these? So for example, if you want to use Mongo, you should probably give up now on GraalVM, because that was like a weekend of job that ended badly. Yeah, so I did that for a while, for a few months. And then I think the thing that really has given me the energy to go back to PCP is some work I did with the guys from DataHike. So the idea of DataHike basically is the durable data log database that's open source. So ideally the open source version of Datomic to a degree. And what happened there was I found the repo and I thought it was really cool, because I use Firebase a lot because it's free, which is the best kind of technology to use. And you get auth for free, you get lots of things for free. So I figured, what if I could make a durable backend that works on Firebase? And conserve is basically a key value store. And so I worked a lot on that protocol, and in implementing the protocol, I really got down and dirty in like working with binary data, doing things efficiently, writing proper tests. So as you can see, I spent a lot of time doing that. Worked in DataHike, made a client for Firebase. And then I was like, okay, I know enough to go back and work on PCP. So I guess the question is, where are we going from here? I'm hoping for a day when we can have a pedal stack. So that's PCP, Nginx, DataHike as a database replacing MySQL, and then obviously Linux. There's still stuff we have to do before we get there. So one is using SCGI is easy, but it's not the fastest. So at the moment, I think the server just dies out if you have more than 40 requests per second, which, to be honest, most small businesses don't have. So it's fine for now, but I do want to use for CGI, because one, that is one of the default configs of Nginx, and the closer to defaults we are, the easier it is for our users. And for CGI is much faster. And I think that's
Alex, sorry, there is a bit of noise coming through, probably because you moved the microphone now.
Oh, I see.
Something. So just to avoid.
Is that better?
Yeah, that.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so the idea here is that you can actually get PCP to be as close as possible to the default Nginx config, so that all you have to do is map your domain and start PCP, and you're good to go. And then the other thing is the multi-part processing I did before. I had worked with the DataHike guys, so I wasn't very experienced in working with binary data. So as you can see, there's a lot of converting to strings and looking for some of the boundaries in the multi-part and using regex, and it works. You can actually submit a multi-part form, but I'm pretty sure that's not optimal in any shape or form. So that's the next thing that I'm looking to tackle, and then hot reloading. So one of the really nice things about live server is that as you work on HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, it reloads the files as you save them. At the moment, PCP doesn't do that, so that would be really cool if we could actually have that reload functionality when you're working locally. And then the last thing is security. I'm not a security expert by any shape or form, And one of the big gripes about PHP is that inexperienced users can make things that are not secure at all. So once I have the fast CGI up and running, I'm looking to actually work a bit more on the security aspect. What I actually have done at the moment, hold on, let me quickly show you, is use secret. So basically, one of the things that is another headache when you're working with multiple clients on the same site is that where do you store your secrets? So the idea is that you have a passphrase that's in your environment. So this tells you what environment variable to look for, and then that's where the passphrase is, and then you can decrypt your secret, right? So the secret name and everything is hidden in here, and then that way you can actually have environment variables in your GitHub repo, and even if it is publicly viewable, that stuff's secure. The only hurdle I ran into is that the server, since it runs as a service, doesn't have the same environment variable space as everything else. So that's a bit of drama that I'm currently working to solve. And I am really close to solving that. But then once you have that, you can actually have, and it's kind of what I'm thinking is that once your setup is up and running, you almost have an endpoint that you can hit, and it just does a git pull, and it pulls the latest code from GitHub, and then your site is up to date. And because it's really just flat files, that's something that happens basically instantly, and there's no build process or anything dramatic like that. And yeah, so that's PCP.